Thank you for staying with us on Citizen Weekend. As promised, I'm joined by Irungu Houghton, who is the Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya. We have joining us from across the border, Don Dea, who is the CEO, the Pan-African Lawyers Union. Good to have you with us in Arusha there. And joining us from Uganda, we have Chris Nkwatsibwe, and he is the team lead, policy, governance, as well as civic engagement for the NGO National Forum, Uganda's National NGO Forum. Good to have all three of you gentlemen with me tonight, and to set the stage for our discussion, the arrests, abductions and deaths of government critics in Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania in the last few months, despite assurances to the contrary, have raised concern that the region is turning into one big police state. Is there a basis for these concerns? Shared values are the foundations of the East Africa community. In the past few months, however, despite assurances to the contrary, President William Ruto of Kenya and President Samia Suluhu Hassan of Tanzania have been accused of reneging on their pledges not to use the security apparatus against their critics. But following protests in Kenya and with local and municipal elections in Tanzania, abductions and deaths at the hands of police have been reported.
Mfano tukio la kutekwa na kuuawa mzee Kipao, watu ambao walijitambulisha ya kwamba ni maskari wa jeshi la polisi wakiwa na silaha walimshusha kwenye basi na mzee Kibao akakutwa akiwa amekufa.
Naona unashangaa watu kwenda na kujitambulisha kwamba wao ni polisi, lakini mara kadhaa tumekamata baadhi ya watu ambao wanajifanya ni askari polisi na sheria iko wazi. Watu wanajipersonate, watu wanajifanya ni askari polisi, wapo watu wanajifanya ni maafisa wa TRA.
Anti-graft protests in Uganda have also been met with a police crackdown, with police in Uganda and Kenya accused of fabricating charges against government critics. In August, Kisumu Governor Anyang' Nyong'o raised the alarm that Kenyan police were guilty of excesses in facilitating the deportation of 36 opposition politicians from Uganda legally in the country from a Kisumu guest house by Ugandan police. All right. What do you make of those events? I'll start with you, Irungu.
No, I think we are seeing a growing authoritarianism in the region, and I think it is a matter of major concern, and a new playbook is required by several governments to ensure that we don't slide into, I guess, practices that we remember from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, but have no place in modern societies and states that are anchored on the right, the rule of law, justice, and democracy. But we are seeing signs, and in many ways, I think what we're, despite the fact that there have been very few constitutional changes or legislative changes, what you're seeing is administrative practices that have no bearing in our courts, no bearing in our laws. And that's why many of the cases that have gone to court have been dismissed. They've been, in the Kenyan context, we've had hundreds of arbitrary arrests that have just been thrown out by the courts because simply the charges were defective, they were malicious, and could not bear the weight of any burden of proof. We've seen also abductions and detentions, and that's been a major concern as well. Practices that we've not really seen since probably the 1980s and potentially the 90s, but particularly the 70s and 80s, where political opposition was declared to be, a threat to the state, and the mere, the right to a conscience, the right to free expression, that is now being criminalized in ways that we've not seen in 20 years. And I think this is really a time for a wake-up by governments, but by civic organizations and citizens.
I'll have you come in at this point, Dawn. Today there was a forum organized by the Tanganyika Law Society, and they were discussing the disappearances that have been witnessed in Tanzania. We heard there from a police commander who said, for example, in Ali Kibao's case, that it was the police who were impersonated, and they're still investigating how he was found dead and tortured using acid. Are those satisfactory answers from where you sit?
No, they are not. No, they are not. The police, neither in Kenya, nor in Uganda, nor in Tanzania, can claim incompetence. Our police are very competent when they're picking us up. And they're very competent to ensure that only they have access to weapons. And in all the cases we see, the Kenyan cases where you have these Subaru boys and so on, the Ugandan cases where you have what they call the drone, which is a Nissan van that has no number plate, and so on, and the Tanzanian case and so on, we're very, very clear on who is picking us up. We're not in doubt. And if the police claim incompetence, that is very okay. We can then renegotiate the social contract and say we go back to the earlier epoch where each of us protect ourselves. Each of us have our own guns and weapons to protect ourselves against people we don't know, the so-called watu wasiojulikana. So they can't have their cake and eat it too. The meeting that our colleague Boniface Mwabukusi, the president of the Tanganyika Law Society, convened in Dar es Salaam today was quite instructive. People spoke, lawyers and non-lawyers, religious leaders, Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, and everyone, and they're able to give testimony on what has happened to them. We have this testimony because as PALU, we have filed cases against the police in Kenya, in South Sudan, in Uganda, in Tanzania, and so on about what they do, and what they do is known. We now have not only impunity in country, but cross-border collusion in impunity. So Kenyan security actors allow South Sudanese security actors to abduct people from Kenyan streets. And they end up in the Kenyan equivalent of Nyayo House, the Blue House in Juba. And some of them end up dead. We have the incident that you brought out, my sister, of 36 Ugandans who were abducted from the Catholic Ukweli Pastoral Center in Kisumu. 35 had crossed lawfully from Uganda and had their passport stamped. One was a lawfully recognized Ugandan refugee protected under international refugee law from Kenya. And they're abducted in a collusion of Kenyan and Ugandan security actors, transported illegally to Uganda, and then they end up in military detention centers, which some people call safe houses, but really they're unsafe houses. And then after 5-6 days of illegal detention, which is a violation of the Ugandan constitution, the Kenyan constitution, international law, they end up being charged with terrorism. And the terrorism charge says either teaching or learning terrorism. You've got to pick a struggle. It can't be both. So we do not agree.
All right, Chris, maybe you can tell us what the situation in Uganda is. Are you witnessing a shrinking of the civic space, or are things as they have been under the Yoweri Museveni administration?
I think that Uganda is regressing. If you look at the civic space index that's produced by quite a number of local organizations, including the National Coalition of Human Rights Defenders, they rank Ugandan civic space to be shrinking. The Civic Space Monitor also categorizes Uganda's space to be extremely regressed and repressed. And I think there are quite a number of indicators to that. If you look at the 1970s, when you had the regime of Idi Amin, where there was no opposition or open criticism was curtailed by the state, now we see the trend is going that direction. While we haven't reached at that particular stage, I think we're heading there. Protest is repressed. You see the police come in to ask Ugandans to seek permission from the police before they protest. And we know that this permission is rarely given by the police force here. what that means as well is that Ugandans have to find different forms of expression. Or if they would like to speak, they use the media platforms that are available, especially the virtual platforms, which are also right now being curtailed by the state through internet shutdowns, but also closure of some of the social media platforms. So the situation is as bad as it is in Tanzania. Of course, we know that Kenya is a little bit more advanced, although we see recently the trend is also heading towards what we see in Uganda today.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of that statement, Irungu, that Kenya has been more advanced, but the trend is that we're moving back?
Yeah. I mean, I think what has shielded us from really some of the darker sides of the events that we've seen in the region has been the Constitution of Kenya. I think the one thing that we have to thank those that voted for the Constitution back in 2010 is that they saw the vision of the separation of powers, that they should not be a direct line between the presidency, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, the National Police Service, and the judiciary, but that these are four independent institutions, and that independence has to be guarded. Now, the Constitution is very clear on this. What we've been worried about is the growing sense that the independent offices and the constitutional commissions are increasingly becoming subject to orders from above. And I think that's been the major concern, is that, you know, we used to say, a bit of a joke, we used to say that forwarded as received was the three most dangerous words in the English language, but I think they've now been replaced with orders from above. And they've been, you know, there are two, I guess, very recent examples for this. The first is the case, the landmark case against 12 police commanders that relates back to 2017 and the attack on Nyalenda, and in particular the killing of baby Pendo, the 6-month baby, during the post-election violence. And it's very clear that, you know, in that context, of course, it's rolling out in court, but it's very clear that commanding officers had a responsibility to either protect or to ensure that there was a due process that was followed in terms of arresting people, rather than the unlawful and very violent means that we saw during the post-election violence. And those 12 officers were in, 11 out of the 12 were in court this week. For the very first time, the Kenyan court is being subjected to a charge that is under the International Criminal Act, Crimes Act, which is essentially a act that looks at crimes against humanity. So in the way that we would have said, don't be vague, go to The Hague, several years ago, what has now happened is that we're now seeing an international convention being played out in a Kenyan court. And this is extremely important. It's important because if we do not see accountability for the repeated use of unlawful force, lethal and less lethal force, then in many ways what you are doing is creating the grounds for impunity and ensuring that there will never be accountability for the deaths that we've seen, even in the last 4 months or so, the 70 deaths that we've seen, or the many injuries and the abductions that are there. So it's really important that we begin to challenge this concept that power needs to be centralized and that it essentially can be expressed through different institutions. But for the Kenyan context, our constitution essentially does not allow for the kind of practices that we saw in the 1990s. Unfortunately, we're starting to see those practices happen more and more again.
Mm-hmm. And Don, I'll have you come in at this point. We have a constitution that has changed the police from a force to a service. We have the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, and our police still seem to be stuck in the colonial era. If you look at what happened at Moi University, if you look at what happened at Multimedia University, not even
2 weeks apart, right?
Exactly. How do we pull, whether it is Jeshi la Polisi in Tanzania, the police in Uganda or Kenya, out of this colonial era? Don, did you catch my question?
Yes, I did. What we have is an avalanche of impunity. What we have is an avalanche of impunity in Kenya, in Uganda, in Tanzania, and I think the most important thing is what the citizens are going to do about it. If you look at the situation of the country of my birth, Kenya. I may sit across the border covering the continent, but Kenya is the country of my birth. Post-2010, literally every arm and institution of government has tried to reform a bit, to try and meet the constitutional requirements a bit. Even the executive has tried, a belt imperfectly, but has tried. The judiciary has tried much more. The legislature has tried much more. The Kenyan police are insistent on moving in the pre-2010 and post-2010 constitutional epoch without any transformation. So I think this calls for a renegotiation of our social contract with them. If you look at the issue of Morara Kebaso, just at the beginning of this week, a charge sheet shows an OB number of Tuesday for a person who was arrested on Monday. That's already illegal. The charge sheet says the complainant is one David Langat. The David Langat comes and says, no, I did not complain. And in any case, even his own statement was taken on Tuesday after the charge had been taken. On what basis did we go to court? Here there was perjury. Whoever signed that thing, the person from ODPP that signed that thing, the police that signed that thing, all of those lied to the court. Those are criminal offenses of perjury, of abuse of office, of false arrest, of malicious prosecution. So we need to really engage as citizens with whether we'll continue to be governed this way. That's us as citizens. And the courts also have to wake up and say, how do you deal with a defective charge sheet or a charge sheet that shows that some people have lied to you? So we need many more people being prosecuted like Masengeli was. We really need a revolution in the region in which we make our police actually serve us, or we completely disband them and start afresh.
All right. I'll bring you in at this point, Chris. In Uganda recently, I think it was in July, we saw protests, anti-corruption protests in Uganda. Protesters arrested outside Parliament. There were the 36 opposition figures who were deported back to Uganda from Kenya and later charged with terrorism. What are the public saying? Is there civic engagement, given the team lead, civic policy governance and civic engagement, the Uganda National NGO Forum?
Yeah, so I think civil society organizations like the Uganda National NGO Forum are doing the best they can to engage citizens and make sure we are creating necessary platforms for them to express what they feel about the state of affairs. What we notice is that there seems to be a connivance between all accountability institutions. So the police will arrest illegally Ugandans that are trying to express themselves, and the Office of the Directorate of Public Prosecutions will sanction charges that are, for lack of a better word, bogus. And you have the judiciary send these young people or the protesters to jail without bail. So this really criminalizes dissent, criminalizes the opportunity for citizens to express themselves. And unfortunately, what we have also witnessed is the fact that the Ugandan states expect citizens to ask for permission to be able to express themselves. And this is contrary to what a democratic dispensation should be. We believe that the state should be the one that seeks permission from the courts to constrain citizens' rights to be able to express themselves. And we saw that when the planned march to Parliament happened. And this was against the backdrop of impunity that had been witnessed. The IGG has recently released a report that Uganda loses close to $6 million a day. And this does not go down well with citizens. So they organized organically protests. The first response from the state was to claim that these protests are inspired by foreign interest. And this was laughable because it basically assumes that Ugandans cannot express themselves or cannot express dissatisfaction without support from other countries or from foreign agents. When that narrative did not sway people from participating in this particular protest, they now moved to threatening and indicating that they would arrest all the protesters that showed up. This could have deterred some significant number of people from coming to the streets, but those who showed up now were faced with the brutality of the state and arrests from police. And this situation continues to happen. Political opposition is constrained from expressing and meeting citizens. It is constrained from engaging in political activity that is supposed to be legitimate. And this points to a situation that is getting worse.
All right, gentlemen, before I let you go tonight, we can lament all night, but how do we get out of the situation we're in? In Kenya, we've changed the constitution and still here we are. Irungu?
So the first thing I think we don't need to do is change the constitution based on the amendment that's before us at the moment. It will not help the situation at all. In fact, the constitutional amendment that's being proposed doesn't seem to deal with some of the most critical human rights and governance related issues. So let me just park that one for a minute. I think there are a number of things. I think, first of all, you know, this situation is probably out of the hands of non-governmental organizations. I think we have to look beyond NGOs to civic organizations, to professional associations like law societies in the region. We have to look to journalists to protect themselves through their professional associations. We have to look to medical protectionists. I mean, one of the things we haven't spoken about is how, you know, medical workers were also targeted by the police very directly during the Gen Z, the Gen Z uprising. And for that reason, you know, we are really worried that actually we're reaching a point where actually there are no rules for this, and there are no standard operating procedures anymore. But essentially, what you're seeing is the unleashing of violence on many cases unarmed people. So I think there are a couple of things. The first is I think we have to get much more granular in terms of the monitoring and the documentation work that we do. We need to get much more bolder in terms of the litigation work. The Law Society, you know, was forced to essentially tenaciously follow the acting Acting Inspector General on the case of the Kitengela 3, and to have an Inspector General be compelled to come to court on I think it was 6 or 7 times, or face civic jail, I think is just one of the examples of how far we've fallen. So I think we need to see constant litigation, public interest litigation. We need to see much more exposure and crowdsourcing of information. One of the reasons that Morara Kebasu probably was not abducted was because there were people following him and live streaming this, and therefore it became very clear that he would have to come to court the next morning. But why he was taken to the Directorate of Criminal Investigations rather than to a police station is still baffling for me. So I think we have to keep pushing on this. We have to keep reminding the state that the greatest challenge to our national security is not, the youth. It is not NGOs. It is not foundations like the Ford Foundation. It is really the lawlessness that we're starting to see in places that we should not see that. I think that's where we need to essentially focus.
All right. Don, before I let you go, we have in Kenya the Interior Cabinet Secretary speaking of 132 missing, which was more than the figure you put out. Yeah. And then in Tanzania, I had the police command talk about 37 persons. And they keep saying they don't know where they are. I
would come back on the good minister in this way. You have a number, therefore there must be a list of names. And the question that we would ask is when, were those names circulated publicly so that it's clear from, the public that, that the government actually is caring about missing persons and abducted persons. It has been a major concern of ours that people don't just go missing, that they are abducted, and that I think, as Don Dare said, there is extreme effectiveness in the way that people are being abducted and detained. And therefore, I was even more worried, I think, when I heard him speak, because the fact that he has more numbers than the human rights organizations is a matter of concern. But the question is, how many of those people have been found since the minister went before the National Assembly? All right. Don, your last word?
I'll tell all our security actors, including the ministers of internal security, including my young brother, Kithure Kindiki, you can't claim incompetence and then keep your job. You are either able to keep us safe or you go home. It can't be both. But the other thing I'll say is that there's a moment of hope. One of the things that has happened is, for the first time in close to 20 years, I monitored these things. We have 3 dynamic, courageous, graceful individuals heading the bar associations in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. I named them in the order in which they were elected. Faith Aoko Dhiambo in Kenya, Boniface Mwabukusi in Tanzania, and Isaac Semakade, who was elected last Saturday in Uganda as president of the Uganda Law Society. It's a unique moment where the legal profession and the East African Law Society has its election in slightly more than a month and a half from now, and Palu is there. It's a unique moment where citizens again and civil society can come together and redirect how we are governed and really call for accountability, especially because the most unaccountable part of our society has been our security sector, especially the police. And I'm calling for something radical. As Kenyans, we know Fungamano. When Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi stopped us from having the constitution we wanted, we went to Fungamano, the faith-based movements, the Catholics, the Protestants, the Muslims, the Hindus, and so on, and we began writing our own constitution. And that scared him so much that he had to bring for us Professor Yashpal Gai, who then helped us get to that moment. So I think we need a regional People's Commission of Inquiry on policing in our region. Just exactly the same thing our brother Boniface Mwabukusi did for Tanzania earlier today, and then we force meaningful change.
All right.
Let me leave it there.
All right, Chris, your last word?
So I think change has never come on a silver platter. I think freedoms are fought for, and I have hope in the young people of the region. I think they are pushing the frontiers. They are engaging the state in ways that we haven't engaged before. And I think change is going to come when we overwhelm the system with the demands for our freedoms, with the demands for expanded space. The other issue is the fact that we have collaborations across the different regions. So Kenyans are talking to Ugandans, Tanzanians are talking to Ugandans, and Tanzanians are talking to Kenyans. And I think this collaboration across the regions gives us the opportunity to be able to build a movement that is sufficient enough to engage our governments to give us the space that we need to be free as a people, as a generation. And then lastly, I think the hope is in the young. The young are creative, they are very dynamic. Uganda's census report indicates that over 50% of Ugandans are below the age of 18. That means the future is still very bright for most of us. Those that are suppressing our rights, our freedoms, are much older than us. And so it's a generation that is passing. So we will have to push them to give us the rights that we need to get.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for taking the time this evening to shed some light on this subject. Irungu Houghton, who is the Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya, in studio. You've heard from Don Dea, who is the CEO, the Pan-African Lawyers Union, speaking to us from Arusha, Tanzania. And we're also joined from Uganda by Chris Nkwatsibwe, who is the team leader, policy, governance and civic engagement, the Uganda National NGO Forum. We take a break, but coming up,